Obviously, in the past, the numbers that we did, we'd work from the beginning, you know, the initial creation of the ideas.
In the mystic haze of guitar smoke and the echoing crash of drum solos, one man stood above the noise, part magician, part mad scientist, and entirely a legend. Jimmy Page wasn't just a musician. He was the architect of one of rock's greatest. Pantheon's Led Zeppelin. But behind the myth of the guitar god with cascading solos and a taste for ancient symbols was a man who was fiercely protective of his art and deeply critical of those who, in his eyes, diluted or disrespected the craft. As Page now reflects in his later years, approaching 82, some truths have come out more freely than they would have in the guarded heights of the 1970s. Among those truths is a bitter list he never spoke aloud in full but hinted at through decades. Of interviews, studio sessions, and stories whispered backstage, the 6 bands he couldn't stand. These weren't petty disagreements or isolated spats. They were philosophical riffs, moments where Jimmy saw something so off in another band's essence that it seemed to clash violently with everything he stood for. And at number 6 on that unspoken list stood none other than the Rolling Stones' Rocks. Quintessential rebels, the untouchable icons. The feud, surprisingly, didn't stem from any major blow-up, but from something more insidious, professional disdain that festered over time. Page once allegedly remarked that the Stones play like they're still learning their instruments every night, a brutal quip that spread quickly through London's music scene in the mid-60s. He respected the blues roots they shared, but he detested the way they commercialized them. He saw them as performers wrapped in swagger, selling something sacred as a fashion statement. At one particularly awkward industry party in 1970, Page reportedly walked away from Keith Richards mid-sentence. After a casual suggestion about collaborating, Richards, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the tension, continued to praise Zeppelin publicly, but Page's silence always spoke louder, the irony. Both bands were giants, moving mountains on the charts, but to Page, the Stones were playing. Dress up in a genre he saw as a spiritual calling. Then came Deep Purple, another band whose legacy intertwined with Zeppelin's in the early days of British hard rock. But for Page, Deep Purple, particularly Ritchie Blackmore, was a thorn in his artistic side. Where Page saw blues as the bloodline of rock, Blackmore brought in classical flourishes, technical wizardry, and what Page reportedly saw as cold precision. There are musicians who feel the music, Page once told a journalist, and there are musicians who calculate it. He didn't name names, but the target was clear. Witnesses claim Page once muttered backstage after a Deep Purple set, "He plays like he's trying to impress his guitar teacher, not the crowd." The rivalry wasn't just stylistic, it was intensely personal. At one point, Page refused to use a studio Deep Purple had just recorded in, allegedly saying he didn't want to catch whatever disease makes you think speed equals soul. Blackmore wasn't silent either. He called Led Zeppelin overhyped and dismissed Page as more of a producer than a player. But the truth is, this rivalry never needed words to thrive. It was a collision of two minds, one rooted in spiritual chaos, the other in technical order. For Page, Deep Purple wasn't just competition. They were the sound of rock losing its soul to scales and speed. And then, of course, there was The Who, a band that shared the same stages, the same generations, and yet stood at the opposite end of everything Jimmy Page believed rock should be. The clash wasn't born in a studio or on a tour bus. It erupted in a philosophy that pitted spectacle against sanctity. Page revered the guitar like an extension of his own body, a relic, a ritual object, a tool for conjuring something sacred. And then came Pete Townshend, smashing his guitar to splinters at the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967. Page, watching from the side of the stage, was reportedly disgusted. "That's not rebellion," he muttered, according to longtime Zeppelin roadie Richard Cole. "That's just waste." It wasn't just the destruction of instruments that offended him. It was what it symbolized, an abandonment of respect for the music itself. To Page, music wasn't about theatrics. It was about soul, discipline, devotion. And The Who, with their chaotic energy and wreckage-heavy shows, represented everything he feared rock could become, a noisy act with no spirit behind it. There was a brief period in the late 70s when the press tried to manufacture camaraderie between the two camps, even suggesting a joint tour, but Page was firmly against it. He reportedly told one promoter, "I won't be on a bill with clowns." And yet, he never spoke ill of Townshend in public. It wasn't his style. Jimmy believed in letting the music speak, but the silence between them was deafening. That same silence surrounded his disdain for other axe bands that, while commercially successful or critically adored, felt to him like cardboard cutouts of deeper ideas. Bands like the Sex Pistols, who Page once referred to off-record as children pretending to be madmen, and even elements of Queen, who he saw as dangerously theatrical. But what ties all these unspoken feuds together isn't ego. It's obsession. Jimmy Page has always been obsessive about tones, arrangements, mythology, timing. Everything had to mean something. Everything had to be earned. So when he looked across the rock landscape and saw bands rising on waves of chaos, or showmanship, or studio gimmicks, it triggered something deeply personal. These weren't just bands he didn't like. They were symbols of the direction he feared rock was heading, style over soul, flash over feeling. And as he enters his 80s, with legacy etched into the bones of music history, Page has grown more candid, more reflective. In rare interviews, when asked about the state of music or the bands he clashed with, he doesn't name names. But the smirk, the pause, the shift in tone, they say enough. Jimmy Page may never publish a list of bands he hated. But if you listen closely to the stories, the silences, and the songs that define an era, you can hear the truth between the notes. In the end, perhaps the real list isn't about hate. It's about love for an art form too sacred to be handled carelessly. And for Jimmy Page, that love meant never compromising, never pretending, and never staying silent when music was at stake. The rivalry between Jimmy Page and The Who intensified in ways that were deeply personal and fundamentally artistic, as Led Zeppelin and The Who jostled for dominance in rock's upper echelon. Their philosophical differences came into sharp focus. While The Who were loud, wild, and known for smashing instruments on stage, Page stood as a beacon of precision and sacred respect for the craft. At a backstage encounter in 1971, witnesses claimed that Page coldly turned away from Pete Townshend, refusing even casual conversation. "I don't associate with vandals," he reportedly told his manager afterward. That wasn't just a jab at, was a declaration of war on the kind of chaos and destruction The Who embodied. Townshend later seemed genuinely puzzled, calling Page technically brilliant but emotionally constipated in a now infamous radio interview. Page's silence only deepened the divide. For him, The Who weren't just a band with a different style, they were a complete rejection of everything he stood for: chaos over composition, destruction over creation, and spectacle over substance. It was the same purist mentality that shaped his quiet but pointed disdain for Pink Floyd. Number 3 on the list of bands Page reportedly loathed wasn't about showmanship or sloppy playing, it was about ideology. The feud with Pink Floyd wasn't loud or public, but it was every bit as real, shaped by years of cold glances and philosophical riffs. According to producer Eddie Kramer, Page once listened to Interstellar Overdrive and dismissed it as pretentious noodling for people who think confusion equals profundity. It wasn't the technical experimentation that irritated him, it was what Pink Floyd represented. While Page's creativity always returned to the emotional roots of the blues, Floyd drifted into spacey, abstract soundscapes that he viewed as detached and soulless. Music should move your soul, not your intellect, Page told Rolling Stone in 1975, widely interpreted as a veiled shot at Pink Floyd's cerebral concept albums. The tension grew even more visible when critics began comparing both bands' use of mysticism and atmosphere. At a 1973 industry event, Page reportedly avoided Roger Waters altogether, later telling associates, "I don't need to explain my music with a philosophy degree." Waters, ever diplomatic, praised Zeppelin publicly, but the iciness between them never thawed. For Page, Floyd wasn't just another band, they were an embodiment of progressive rock's most dangerous tendencies, prioritizing intellect over Instinct, concept over feeling, and art school pretension over raw musical emotion. When Floyd played to the mind, Page insisted music should speak to the heart. That chasm in creative belief was simply too wide to cross. But if Pink Floyd represented art school pretension, then Jethro Tull number 2 on this unspoken blacklist was, to Page, nothing short of musical heresy. The tension reportedly began in the early 1970s when Ian Anderson's flute-driven, theatrical folk rock was being categorized in the same musical circles as Zeppelin's thunderous, blues-rooted heaviness. The idea that both could coexist in the same genre seemed to infuriate Page. According to former Atlantic Records executive Jerry Greenberg, Page once attended a Jethro Tull concert and afterward remarked, "A man playing a flute in tights is not rock and roll. It's Renaissance fair entertainment." That wasn't just criticism, it was a rejection of their entire artistic identity. What especially aggravated Page was Anderson's stage presence, theatrical, cheeky, and whimsical. Page saw himself as the high priest of heaviness, crafting mystic soundscapes with crushing riffs and lyrical darkness. In contrast, Jethro Tull's style, with its quirky melodies and medieval flourishes, felt like a betrayal of everything Page believed rock music should represent. The feud reached its boiling point at the 1989 Grammy Awards, when Jethro Tull famously and controversially won the award for Best Hard Rock Metal Performance over Metallic. Page wasn't even nominated, but witnesses at the afterparty claim he was visibly furious. "This proves the industry doesn't understand what heavy music actually is," he reportedly snapped. Later, music journalist Jeff Barton claimed Page told him, "When a band with a flute player can win a metal award, the whole genre has lost its meaning." Though Ian Anderson would later speak admiringly of Led Zeppelin's influence, Page never softened. To him, Jethro Tull wasn't just a strange anomaly, they were proof that rock's purity was being compromised by theatrics and genre confusion. And that brings us to number 1, a name that might shock even the most hardcore rock historians, Black Sabbath. Yes, the very band often credited with inventing heavy metal reportedly earned Jimmy Page's deepest contempt, according to former Sabbath manager Patrick Meehan. The rift began as early as 1970. Page had reportedly attended one of their recording sessions and dismissed their sound entirely. "They're not musicians. They're just loud," he allegedly told producer Roger Bain. "Anyone can play fast and sloppy." What infuriated him wasn't just Sabbath's rawness, it was their success with it. While Page was laboring over alternate tunings, Eastern influences, and perfect studio production, Sabbath, fronted by working-class Birmingham boys, was storming the charts with what Page reportedly called three-chord nightmares. The hostility climaxed when critics began crediting Sabbath with inventing heavy metal, a crown Page believed rightfully belonged to Zeppelin. According to roadie Richard Cole, Page even kept newspaper clippings highlighting this growing debate, brooding over them with a mixture of bitterness and betrayal. At a 1971 industry event, Page allegedly confronted Tony Iommi face-to-face, saying, "You're not heavy. You're just untalented and turned up loud." Iommi was reportedly stunned, and later remarked that while Page was brilliant, he missed the point of what we were trying to do. For Page, Sabbath wasn't just another competitor, they were an existential threat to everything he worked to build. To him, they symbolized the decay of musicianship in favor of distortion, volume, and brute force. They were loud, dark, and influential, but in Page's eyes, they were also proof that rock had begun losing its depth, its detail, and its discipline. And so, the list of enemies wasn't just about personal grudges, it was about defending an ideal. Was Jimmy Page a purist hero fighting for the soul of music, or an elitist unwilling to accept change? That's up to the fans to decide. What's clear is that even rock gods have rivals, and sometimes their greatest clashes never happen on stage, but in the quiet bitterness between chords, notes, and ideologies.